The house on 15th Street looked calm beneath the cold Colorado sky, wrapped in quiet the way only Christmas night can be. Snow rested gently on the roof, and the glow from the streetlights reflected off the decorations that still shimmered from the evening celebration. Inside, the warmth of the house lingered, mixed with the faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree and the remains of a joyful day. The Ramsey family had returned home late from a holiday gathering, tired but content. Laughter had filled the car on the drive back, and the excitement of Christmas morning was still alive in the children's minds. JonBenét Ramsey had fallen asleep on the way home. She was carried inside, her head resting softly against her father's shoulder, her blonde hair catching the light as they passed through the front door. She was placed gently into her bed, still wearing the clothes she had worn to the party. Her room was filled with toys, ribbons, and pageant trophies that reflected a childhood spent partly under bright stage lights and applause. To the outside world, JonBenét was a familiar face, a child star with a confident smile. To her family, she was simply a little girl who loved to sing, dance, and be admired. The house settled into silence as the family went to sleep. Doors were locked, lights were turned off, and the world outside faded into darkness. No alarms sounded. No screams were heard. Nothing about the night suggested that anything was wrong. And yet, somewhere within those hours, something terrible unfolded. Morning came quietly at first. The sky was still pale when JonBenét's mother went downstairs, expecting to begin the rituals of Christmas Day. Gifts waited beneath the tree, neatly arranged and untouched. The house should have been filled with excitement. Instead, one strange detail shattered the illusion of normalcy. On the staircase leading down to the kitchen lay several pages of paper, placed carefully, as if meant to be seen immediately. The words on the pages were alarming. They claimed that JonBenét had been taken, kidnapped during the night by someone demanding money. The note was unusually long, filled with dramatic warnings and specific instructions. It spoke of threats and consequences, of careful planning and control. It demanded a ransom amount that felt oddly precise, as if chosen for a reason known only to the writer. Fear spread instantly. A child was missing. The house that had felt safe only hours before now felt unfamiliar, almost hostile. Panic overpowered logic. Despite the note's warning not to contact authorities, the police were called. The idea of waiting, of doing nothing, was impossible. Officers arrived quickly, their presence bringing both relief and unease. They moved through the house, asking questions, checking rooms, trying to understand what had happened. But from the very start, the story refused to follow any familiar pattern. There were no broken windows, no forced doors, no clear path of entry or escape. The idea of a kidnapper seemed real on paper, yet unsupported by the house itself. The ransom note raised more questions than answers. It had been written inside the home, using items that belonged there. It was not rushed, not scribbled in fear or haste. It felt rehearsed, almost theatrical. Some phrases sounded borrowed, as if inspired by movies or books. The handwriting appeared careful, yet uneven, as though the writer was trying to disguise something. Every word felt deliberate. As hours passed, tension grew heavier. The police searched the house again and again, calling out JonBenét's name, hoping for an answer that never came. Friends and neighbors arrived, offering comfort, filling the space with worried voices and movement. In their attempts to help, they unknowingly disturbed the scene, touching surfaces, opening doors, shifting objects that might have held clues. The line between order and chaos blurred. Time stretched painfully. The ransom call never came. The instructions in the note led nowhere. With each passing moment, the possibility that JonBenét was still alive began to fade, replaced by a fear no one wanted to voice. Then, in a moment that would define the case forever, the truth emerged. During another search of the house, a hidden room in the basement was opened. What was found there ended all hope and rewrote the story completely. JonBenét had never left the house. The kidnapping was not real. The danger had been inside all along. The discovery sent shockwaves through everyone present. A home that had been seen as a place of wealth, success, and family love had become the scene of a brutal crime. The contrast was unbearable. Christmas decorations still hung upstairs, untouched, while tragedy waited in the shadows below. From that moment, the case transformed. It was no longer about a missing child, but about a murder that made no sense. The ransom note became something else entirely. No longer a warning, but a question. Who wrote it, and why? Was it meant to mislead, to buy time, or to hide something far worse? As the sun rose higher in the sky, news began to spread beyond the house, beyond the street, beyond the town. Reporters would soon arrive, cameras ready, questions prepared. But inside the home, the world had already collapsed. The silence left behind was heavier than any noise could be. Chapter 1 of this story does not end with answers. It ends with a door opened too late, a truth revealed too suddenly, and a mystery born in the very place that should have been safest. What happened during those quiet hours of Christmas night would become one of the most haunting questions in modern crime history. A question that began not with violence, but with a piece of paper on a staircase and a family waking into unimaginable horror. By the time the house was officially sealed, the damage had already been done. What should have been treated as a controlled crime scene had instead become a place of confusion, fear, and constant movement. Officers, friends, neighbors, and family members had walked through hallways and rooms, touching door handles, wiping counters, opening drawers, and unknowingly erasing fragile traces that might have spoken the truth. From the very beginning, the investigation felt one step behind, chasing answers that seemed to disappear the moment they were noticed. Detectives began with the most obvious question. How could a child be murdered inside her own home without anyone hearing or seeing anything unusual? The house was large, with multiple floors, winding hallways, and hidden corners. Sounds could easily be swallowed by walls and distance, especially during the quiet hours of the night. Still, the idea that such a crime could happen unnoticed felt deeply unsettling. Attention quickly returned to the ransom note. Investigators read it again and again, searching for meaning between the lines. It was far longer than any typical ransom message, almost as if the writer wanted to explain themselves. The tone shifted strangely, moving from threatening to oddly polite, then back to aggressive. It demanded a specific amount of money, an amount that did not seem random. To detectives, this detail felt personal, as if the writer knew the family more closely than a stranger should. Handwriting experts were called in. They studied every cave, every hesitation, every pressure mark on the paper. Some believed the writing showed signs of stress. Others believed it showed control. Opinions conflicted, just as they would throughout the entire case. There was no single conclusion. No moment where everyone agreed. Instead, there were only possibilities, each leading in a different direction. The basement became another focus of intense scrutiny. The room where JonBenét was found felt separate from the rest of the house, hidden away like a secret. The location raised uncomfortable questions. Why there? Why choose a place so close, yet so concealed? It suggested familiarity with the house, someone who knew where to go and how to avoid being seen. But again, this pointed both inward and outward at the same time, accusing everyone and no one. The physical evidence told a complicated story. Injuries suggested both force and hesitation, moments of violence mixed with moments that felt disturbingly calm. Investigators struggled to determine the order of events, what came first and what followed. Nothing lined up neatly. Each interpretation seemed to contradict another piece of evidence. As word of the crime spread, the media descended on the quiet neighborhood. News vans lined the streets. Cameras pointed at the house day and night. Reporters spoke in hushed, dramatic tones, describing every detail as if it were a piece of a grand puzzle. The tragedy quickly became a spectacle. The child was no longer just a victim. She was a headline. Public attention created pressure, and pressure created mistakes. Every action by investigators was watched and judged. Every decision was questioned. The desire to solve the case quickly began to compete with the need to solve it correctly. In this tension, clarity was lost. Suspicion began to move like a shadow, shifting from one theory to another. Some believed an intruder had entered quietly, committed the crime, and vanished without a trace. Others believed the scene showed signs of staging, as if someone wanted the crime to look like something it was not. Each theory sounded convincing until it was examined closely, at which point it fell apart. The idea of an intruder raised its own problems. If someone had entered the house, how did they get in? Why leave behind a child instead of taking her, as the note claimed? Why write such a long message and risk being discovered? The risk seemed enormous, the reward unclear. The alternative theories were just as troubling. If the crime involved someone inside the house, then the meaning of safety itself was shattered. The idea that danger could come from within was something no one wanted to accept. Investigators were forced to walk a careful line, balancing evidence with sensitivity, logic with emotion. As days passed, interviews multiplied. Questions were asked again and again, sometimes rephrased, sometimes repeated exactly. Small inconsistencies were noticed, magnified, debated endlessly. Were they signs of deception, or simply the result of trauma and shock? No one could agree. DNA evidence offered a faint hope. Samples were collected, catalogued, and tested. The results were inconclusive. Some findings suggested the presence of someone unknown, but they did not lead to a clear identity. The evidence existed, yet refused to speak clearly. It became another piece of the puzzle that raised more questions than it answered. Meanwhile, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Empty now, it stood as a silent witness, filled with rooms that once echoed with laughter and now felt heavy with absence. Investigators walked its floors repeatedly, imagining movements, testing theories, trying to recreate moments that could never truly be known. Outside, opinions hardened. People chose sides, even without facts. Some were certain they knew what happened. Others were just as certain that those beliefs were wrong. The case became less about evidence and more about interpretation. Every new detail was filtered through bias, fear, and expectation. The investigation stretched on, slowed by uncertainty and haunted by early mistakes. What should have been a clear search for truth became a tangled web of speculation. Leads were followed, then abandoned. Tips poured in from across the country, most of them useless, some dangerously misleading. Chapter 2 of this story is defined by confusion. It is the chapter where nothing fits, where every answer creates two more questions. It is the chapter where the crime refuses to behave like a crime, where logic bends and certainty disappears. The murder was no longer just an event that needed solving. It was a mystery that seemed to resist being understood. By the end of this stage, one thing was clear to everyone involved. This was not going to be a case with a quick resolution. Whatever happened that night had buried itself deep, beneath layers of error, emotion, and doubt. And as time moved forward, the truth did not come closer. It moved further away, hiding in the spaces between what was known and what could never be proven. As the investigation pushed forward, something else began to grow just as quickly: suspicion. It did not move with logic or patience. It spread through television screens, newspapers, and whispered conversations, shaping opinions long before facts could settle. The case was no longer confined to police files and interview rooms. It had entered living rooms across the country, where millions of people watched, listened, and judged. The family at the center of the tragedy found themselves trapped in an impossible position. They were grieving the loss of a child while being observed as potential suspects. Every word they spoke was replayed. Every pause was analyzed. Their expressions were slowed down, frozen, and interpreted by strangers who believed truth could be read from body language alone. What should have been private mourning became a public performance they never agreed to give. Investigators continued their work, but now they were operating under an intense spotlight. Decisions that would normally remain confidential were debated openly in the media. Leaks appeared. Anonymous sources shared fragments of information, sometimes accurate, sometimes misleading. Each leak created new headlines, and each headline hardened public opinion even further. Inside the investigation, frustration grew. Detectives felt the pressure to produce results, but the evidence refused to cooperate. Interviews were revisited, not because new information had emerged, but because old answers were now being questioned through a different lens. Trauma affects memory, yet inconsistencies were often treated as signs of guilt rather than human response to shock. The ransom note returned again and again as a symbol of the mystery. Some believed it was the key to everything. Others believed it was a distraction meant to pull attention away from the real truth. Linguists studied its language, noting unusual phrasing and strange emotional shifts. They argued over whether it sounded rehearsed or impulsive, whether it reflected panic or control. Each interpretation pointed in a different direction. Meanwhile, the child at the center of the case seemed to fade behind the noise. JonBenét became less a person and more a symbol, a face attached to theories rather than memories. Her photographs were everywhere, smiling brightly from pageant stages, frozen in moments of joy that felt painfully distant from the violence of her death. The contrast made the story even harder to let go of. Alternative theories began to compete fiercely. Some suggested a stranger had been watching the house, learning routines, waiting for the right moment. Others believed the crime was the result of a terrible accident that spiraled out of control. There were even theories involving multiple people, secret plans, and hidden motives. Each theory had supporters who defended it passionately, as if solving the case were a matter of belief rather than evidence. The investigators themselves were divided. Different teams followed different paths, sometimes working in parallel, sometimes in quiet conflict. One group focused on the possibility of an outsider, while another examined the events inside the house more closely. Cooperation existed, but trust was fragile. Early mistakes had left scars, and no one wanted to be responsible for another misstep. As months passed, the case lost its urgency in official terms but gained weight in public memory. New stories replaced it in the news cycle, yet it never truly disappeared. Every so often, a new interview or leaked detail would bring it roaring back into attention, reopening wounds and reigniting arguments. For the family, time did not heal. It stretched the pain instead, turning it into something constant and heavy. They lived under a shadow that followed them everywhere. Simple actions felt loaded with meaning. Silence was seen as suspicious. Speaking out was seen as defensive. There was no correct way to exist under such scrutiny. The idea of truth became increasingly complicated. Was truth something that could be proven, or something that people decided to believe? In the absence of a clear answer, stories filled the gap. Some were told with confidence, others with anger. Few were told with humility. Investigators continued to examine physical evidence, hoping science would succeed where human judgment had failed. DNA samples were rechecked, catalogued, and stored for future testing. Technology was advancing, and with it came the hope that one day the evidence would speak more clearly. But hope was fragile, easily shaken by each new dead end. Inside the empty house, echoes lingered. The walls held memories that could not be measured or tested. Investigators walked through rooms imagining movements, recreating possibilities, trying to align timelines that refused to stay straight. Every reconstruction depended on assumptions, and assumptions were dangerous in a case already full of doubt. Public debate grew harsher. Online forums and talk shows turned the case into a battleground of opinions. People argued not only about what happened, but about what kind of people they believed the family to be. Empathy faded, replaced by certainty. The mystery became personal for those watching, as if solving it would restore order to a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. Chapter 3 is where the case truly fractured. It split into versions, each claiming to be the most logical, the most honest, the most complete. In reality, each version was missing something. Pieces of the truth were scattered, buried beneath noise, bias, and the passage of time. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more it revealed about the world surrounding it. It exposed the limits of investigation under pressure. It showed how quickly tragedy can turn into spectacle. It demonstrated how easily grief can be mistaken for guilt, and how uncertainty invites judgment. By the end of this chapter, the murder was no longer just an unsolved crime. It was a mirror reflecting fear, obsession, and the human need for closure. The truth still existed somewhere, hidden in the space between what was known and what was assumed. But reaching it now seemed harder than ever, not because there were no clues, but because there were too many voices drowning them out. And in that growing silence beneath the noise, the most important voice of all remained unheard. Years passed, and with them came a strange mixture of distance and persistence. The murder no longer dominated nightly news broadcasts, yet it never truly faded. It lived on in archives, in documentaries, in quiet conversations that resurfaced whenever a new development appeared. Chapter 4 begins in this long stretch of time, when the case was no longer new, but still painfully unfinished. Advances in forensic science slowly reopened doors that had once been sealed shut. Techniques that were unavailable in the early days of the investigation now offered new ways to examine old evidence. Items collected from the house were carefully retrieved from storage, treated with renewed attention and hope. Investigators believed that science, not speculation, might finally provide clarity where human judgment had failed. DNA testing became the center of renewed focus. Samples that once produced unclear or partial results were reanalyzed using improved methods. The process was slow and delicate, requiring patience and precision. Each test carried enormous weight. A single match could change everything. A single exclusion could collapse years of assumptions. When results began to emerge, they did not bring certainty, but they did shift the ground beneath the case. Some findings suggested the presence of genetic material that did not belong to any known family member. This discovery reignited the intruder theory and challenged long-held beliefs. For some, it felt like validation. For others, it only deepened the confusion. The question returned with new intensity. If someone else was involved, who were they? And how had they vanished so completely? The house was re-examined through this lens. Entry points were reconsidered. Windows and doors once dismissed were studied again. Investigators asked whether something had been overlooked, not out of negligence, but because early assumptions had guided attention in the wrong direction. At the same time, the wounds of the past reopened. Each new announcement brought the case back into public discussion, dragging old pain into the present. Media coverage returned with familiar urgency, often repeating earlier narratives instead of exploring new ones. The family, once again, found themselves at the center of attention they did not seek. Interviews from years earlier were replayed alongside new statements. Time had changed voices, faces, and emotions, but the questions remained stubbornly the same. Some people believed that time revealed truth, that inconsistencies would become clearer with distance. Others believed that time only blurred memories further, making certainty even more difficult. Investigators faced another challenge: trust. Early mistakes had damaged confidence in the process, both internally and publicly. Every decision was now scrutinized not just for accuracy, but for symbolism. Choosing which evidence to test, which theory to pursue, and which voices to listen to carried political and emotional weight. The science itself was not as simple as many hoped. DNA evidence, while powerful, does not always tell a complete story. It can suggest presence without explaining context. It can exist without indicating guilt. Interpreting it required caution, especially in a case already shaped by misunderstanding. As testing continued, legal boundaries became more visible. Evidence could not be endlessly re-examined without justification. Resources were limited. Priorities had to be set. The case existed within a system that balanced hope for resolution against the reality of countless other unsolved crimes. Outside official channels, independent researchers and investigators emerged. Some were motivated by genuine curiosity and compassion. Others were driven by certainty, convinced they had solved the mystery where authorities had failed. Books were written, theories presented as conclusions, speculation framed as fact. The line between investigation and storytelling grew increasingly thin. The internet amplified everything. Discussion spread rapidly, fueled by passion rather than restraint. New generations discovered the case not as a real tragedy, but as a puzzle to be solved. The child at the center risked becoming lost again, this time beneath layers of digital debate. Despite all this noise, moments of quiet progress did occur. Files were reorganized. Timelines were clarified. Investigators acknowledged past errors openly, understanding that transparency was necessary for credibility. This honesty, though painful, marked a turning point. It suggested that learning from failure might be the only way forward. Hope flickered cautiously. Not the dramatic hope of sudden revelation, but the steady belief that persistence mattered. That truth did not disappear simply because time passed. That evidence, properly understood, could still speak. Yet Chapter 4 is also defined by restraint. No arrest was made. No definitive statement ended the mystery. Each advancement came paired with a reminder of limits. Science could narrow possibilities, but it could not rewrite the past. It could suggest paths, but it could not force answers. For the family, these years were a test of endurance. Grief evolved, but it did not vanish. It changed shape, becoming quieter, heavier, more internal. Public attention felt less explosive, but more permanent. The case followed them like a shadow that lengthened rather than faded. They lived between two realities, one where progress suggested vindication, and another where suspicion never fully dissolved. This tension shaped every interaction, every statement, every silence. Even hope came with caution, because disappointment had arrived too many times before. Chapter 4 does not deliver resolution, but it restores complexity. It reminds us that unsolved cases are not frozen in time. They move, slowly and unevenly, shaped by technology, culture, and memory. Each new development is built on what came before, including mistakes, misunderstandings, and moments of courage. As this chapter closes, the case stands at a crossroads. The past has been re-examined, but the future remains uncertain. Evidence exists, but interpretation remains contested. The truth feels closer than it once did, yet still out of reach. What remains undeniable is that the story is not finished. It waits, patiently, for something still missing. A connection not yet made. A voice not yet heard. And until that moment arrives, the mystery continues, suspended between what science can reveal and what only the truth itself can resolve. The final chapter of this story exists in a space where time seems to stand still. Years have turned into decades, and yet the question remains unanswered. What truly happened on that quiet Christmas night? Chapter 5 is not about discovery, but about endurance. It is about a case that refuses to close, a mystery that lingers not because it is forgotten, but because it is remembered too well. As official investigation slowed, the case entered a different phase, one defined by waiting. Files remained open, evidence preserved, possibilities held in careful suspension. Law enforcement agencies acknowledged that while no arrest had been made, the search for truth had not ended. The case was no longer active in the traditional sense, but it was never abandoned. It existed in a state of readiness, prepared for the moment when a new detail, a new technology, or a new voice might finally unlock what had been sealed for so long. Public interest never fully disappeared. It resurfaced in waves, often triggered by anniversaries, documentaries, or renewed forensic discussions. Each resurgence brought the same familiar arguments, the same divisions, the same emotional intensity. For some, the mystery represented a failure of justice. For others, it was a cautionary tale about assumptions and judgment. And for many, it remained a haunting reminder that not every story has an ending. The child at the center of it all became a symbol of unresolved grief. Her image, forever young, remained frozen in time. People who had never met her felt connected to her story, drawn in by the innocence lost and the silence that followed. This connection fueled a desire for answers that never faded, even as certainty grew harder to reach. Over time, the conversation around the case began to change. Where there had once been loud certainty, there was now quieter reflection. Some people reconsidered beliefs they once held strongly. Others acknowledged that the truth might be more complicated than any single theory allowed. The passage of time softened some edges, even as it sharpened the pain of not knowing. Investigators revisited the case periodically, reviewing evidence with fresh eyes. Each review carried hope, however cautious. Technology continued to advance, offering new methods of analysis that had once seemed impossible. But technology alone could not fill every gap. Evidence ages. Memories fade. Context shifts. The past resists being fully reconstructed. The legal system also imposed its own boundaries. Without definitive proof, action could not be taken. Suspicion, no matter how intense, was not enough. The standard required certainty, and certainty remained elusive. This restraint, though frustrating, was necessary. It was a reminder that justice must be built on truth, not desire. For the family, life continued in parallel with the case. They lived years that the public did not see, marked by private grief rather than headlines. They carried the weight of loss quietly, shaped by experiences no one else could fully understand. Their story was often told by others, framed by opinions rather than facts. Yet their reality remained deeply personal, untouched by speculation. The house, once the center of attention, became just another structure over time. New occupants lived within its walls, unaware or perhaps unburdened by its past. But for those who remembered, the house remained symbolic, a place where safety had been shattered and certainty lost. It stood as a reminder that tragedy can occur anywhere, even in spaces that appear untouched by danger. The case also left a lasting impact on how investigations were conducted. It became a lesson studied by professionals, highlighting the importance of preserving crime scenes, managing media involvement, and avoiding early conclusions. In this way, the mystery contributed to change, even without resolution. Its legacy extended beyond itself, shaping future efforts to seek justice more carefully. As years passed, the idea of closure became more complex. Some believed closure required an arrest, a conviction, a clear narrative. Others began to understand that closure might never come in that form. Instead, it might exist in remembrance, in continued effort, in refusing to let the truth be replaced by silence. The case occupied a unique place in public consciousness. It was not just unsolved, it was unresolved. It lived on in questions rather than answers. Each person who encountered the story carried away a different version, shaped by belief, emotion, and interpretation. In this way, the mystery became many mysteries, overlapping but never aligning completely. Chapter 5 is defined by uncertainty, but also by persistence. It acknowledges that while the truth has not been revealed, the search itself matters. It honors the idea that some questions are worth asking even when answers remain distant. It recognizes the limits of knowledge without surrendering to them. The silence surrounding the crime is not empty. It is filled with possibility, with the understanding that truth does not expire. Somewhere, in evidence yet to be understood or connections yet to be made, the answer still exists. Whether it will ever be known is uncertain. But uncertainty does not equal defeat. As this story reaches its end, it does not offer resolution, because resolution has not yet arrived. Instead, it offers reflection. It invites viewers to consider not only what happened, but how we respond to the unknown, how we balance curiosity with compassion, how we seek justice without sacrificing fairness. The murder remains unsolved, suspended between past and future. It waits quietly, not demanding attention, but deserving it. And until the day when the final piece falls into place, the story continues, not as a closed case, but as an open question, echoing through time, asking to be answered.